Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight Bookstore, and we're excited to host tonight's event with Molly Wizenberg presenting her new book, The Fixed Stars. She'll be talking with Helen Rosner, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Molly and the team at Abrams for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. So we're not able to host events in our store spaces. Our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started, I just have a couple of housekeeping things to go over. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen, so the exact location will depend on what kind of device you're using. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the authors and to interact with fellow attendees. And if you have a specific question that you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two little speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so make sure that you're putting your questions there and not in the chat. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Fixed Stars, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to be able to offer actual shopping in our bookstore locations, 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. Tuesday through Saturday, and you can purchase Molly's book and many others on site. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the U.S. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer for this evening is Helen Rosner. She writes about food, mostly, for The New Yorker. She has worked at Savor and New York Magazine, launched the seminal food site Eat Me Daily, and served as a cookbook editor. Before joining The New Yorker, she was the executive editor of Eater, where she founded the publication's James Beard and National Magazine award-winning features department. She won a James Beard Award in 2016 for her Ode to Chicken Tenders, published in Guernica. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Molly Wizenberg. She is the author of 2 best-selling books, A Homemade Life and Delancey, and the James Beard Award-winning blog Orangeette. She has written for the New York Post, The Guardian, Savor, and Bon Appetit, and she also co-hosts the podcast Spilled Milk with chef Brandon Pettit. Weisenberg co-founded the award-winning Seattle restaurants Delancey and Essex. Her new book, The Fixed Stars, is a taut, electrifying memoir exploring timely and timeless questions about desire, identity, and the limits and possibilities of family. Molly and Helen are going to jump into their discussion, and then we'll be opening up to questions after that. Please take it away, Molly and Helen.
Thank you.
Hey. Oh, this is going to be so much fun. I also want to apologize both to Molly and to everybody because I was having mild technical difficulties, and I currently have like 3 different screens in front of me. And so if it looks like I'm distracted and looking off camera, it's just because I have a lot going on. So hi, I'm Helen Rosner. Hi, Molly. Hi, people we can't see. This is really wonderful. It's so great to be sharing a screen with you right now.
I love it. So I was realizing that I think I had a phone call with you once a million years ago when you were working with Savor, and you interviewed me about my kitchen, which is this like, it is not the kind of kitchen people feature in magazines. It's behind me. I don't know if you can see these old knotty pine cabinets and like industrial kitchen shelving. But anyway, that's the only time I've ever gotten to talk to you in person, sort of.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because I wasn't sure if we'd ever met in real life, and I felt like that was an awkward question to ask. And so you've taken that responsibility for me. That's great. No, well, because so we've known each other for a very long time because you are a food blogger. I mean, I think that maybe that's something we can also talk about, but for a very long time, you had, I think, arguably one of the internet's premier food blogs back in the golden age of food blogging. And I worked at a magazine that was really interested in food blogs. And so we crossed paths a number of times. And then, I don't know, many years have gone by and our lives are now radically different. And here we are talking about your memoir. Actually, before we jump into talking about your memoir, just for everybody who's tuned in, just so that you know how the next hour or so of your life is going to go, Molly and I are going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time to take your questions. So you can pop them in, as Kate said already, you can pop them in the Q&A down there at any point as the spirit moves you over the course of our conversation. But I'll also remind you again once we get closer to the Q&A part if things come to mind. But we're just going to talk, Molly, about you and your feelings and your love life and everything.
Great. I love to talk about these things on Zoom with an audience.
Well,
it's my new favorite thing to do.
Well, is it different than writing a memoir? I think that one of the first things I really wanted to ask you about, and I'm assuming that everybody here, at least if you haven't read the book yet, you should read it because it's incredible. But I'm assuming you at least sort of generally know, broadly speaking, what The Fixed Stars is about. As you've described it, Molly, it's a book about divorce and sexuality and finding yourself and figuring out what the self is. And to do sort of a quick plot summary, this will be spoiler filled, I suppose. At the beginning of the book,
I feel like this isn't a book that really like has spoilers. I feel like if you read the copy, you kind of get the gist of it. It's more about like themes than a plot, anyway.
Yeah. But like roughly speaking, the plot is that at the beginning of the book, you are married to a man, and at the end of the book, you are partnered in a gay relationship or a queer relationship. And in the middle, a lot of stuff happens. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a memoirist. I write sort of, I don't know, things that are not memoirs. Mm-hmm. And I've struggled as a writer with the idea of memoir. It's something that I love to consume as a reader, but I have a hard time. I love talking about myself. I'm a wild narcissist, but I have a really hard time with the physical process of kind of distilling myself and my analysis of myself onto the page. And it's something that you appear to do effortlessly. And I'm sure a lot of work goes into things that look effortless. But sitting here on a Zoom conversation talking about yourself versus sitting in front of a computer writing about yourself, I don't know, are they the same? Are they different?
Oh, they're hugely different. I think that for me, so I think that I have tended to write about myself and my own life because writing is where I do my best thinking. And I mean, I think that's true for many writers, maybe most writers. And for me, I think that something, sort of these like thematic questions that have always followed me around, whether I thought that I was just writing about food or whether I was writing about sexuality, like these big questions that have followed me around are things like where, like what gets us out of bed in the morning? What gets me out of bed in the morning? Like what makes my life feel fulfilling? What makes me feel connected to other people? What is a good relationship for me? And these are questions that I have always used writing to work out, whether I was writing about like the story behind a recipe or writing about, things far away from food, like divorce. And so I love that. I love even though I feel like when I sit down to write something, I sit down to write it because I am ready to communicate it. And I want to ultimately communicate it in a way that someone else could understand. At the same time, there is this wonderful in-between, like, private period when it's just you and the words, like, figuring each other out. And I think that is what I keep striving for again and again, like getting back to that feeling and that place where it's just me with the words, figuring out what I think, and trying to make meaning out of the raw material of just everyday chaotic life.
Yeah. Is there I know that you teach writing and teach memoir writing. Is there like a toolkit for successfully distilling one's own life? I mean, I think that something that I've talked about a lot with other writers and with friends who are journalers as opposed to journalists, which I think is a really important distinction,
Mhm.
is that there's a big difference between journaling and memoir. And often I think that for maybe a beginning or aspiring memoirist, that can be a, a tough lesson to learn, that
Mhm.
something that is you figuring something out for yourself
Yeah,
is different than figuring something out for readers.
absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting. It's been interesting for me to, over the years, learn what it is that I am doing so that I can teach it. Because I think that on the surface, well, so I think my writing is very feelings based. It's very much based in emotion. And then my challenge is to try to give that emotion to my reader through concrete information, or through a scene that presents concrete information that evokes in a reader the feeling that it evoked in me living it. Does that make any sense? And so it's so different from the activity, or it's so different from what happens when I'm not a big journaler, but I have been, like, in periods of my life. Like I did journal a lot as the early part of the experience that I write about in this book as it was happening. But my journaling looks so different and so much more abstract than ultimately what I want a reader to read. I think so. Mary Karr, have you read the book The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr?
No,
Oh,
I
it's so
should, I
good.
guess.
And it's so Mary Karr. I mean, it is, not only is it like an incredible guide to writing personal narrative, but it is like dripping in her voice, which is so fun. Oh, is someone having trouble?
Oh, audio and video are pretty smooth for me. How are they for you?
Maybe Greenlight can help us out with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
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 Um,
I was going to say that, so this book, The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr, she talks about how our job as writers, no matter what we're writing, is to make our reader feel as though they're like zipped into the avatar of our consciousness, sort of like that. If she is presenting a scene vividly enough, the reader will feel as though they are like lodged inside this memory. And I think that applies, I mean, certainly to a particular type of storytelling. But that's something that I think about a lot, and something that I actually think food writing taught me, in a sense, really.
Tell me more about that.
Well, food writing is inherently very specific writing, right? I mean, we could write about like hot dogs in general, or we could write about like the state of big agriculture in general, or something like that. But in terms of narrative food writing, or food writing that tells a story, like we never just eat a hot dog in general, right? It's always like the hot dog I ate while I was on that Zoom call with Helen Rosner, or
Hell of a Zoom call. Yeah.
right? I know. Anyway, so I think that trying to write, in particular, trying to write about home cooking, which is what I was always interested in, what I've always been interested in, is inherently very specific writing. Like, I'm never just cooking spaghetti bolognese in a vacuum, right? It's got a whole context, a very concrete information. And I think what makes that kind of storytelling, especially about like ordinary everyday life, feel worth reading is when we can actually tune into the specifics of a scene, because that's what's going to make it feel universal when our reader is inhabiting it through our words.
So do you think that that's something specific to writing about food, or do you think it's just that you happened to choose food as the entry point for starting to experiment and become more confident in a space that was effectively memoir? Well, now you're frozen.
Applies to all different kinds of writing about all different kinds of things. But I think for me, in ways that I could never have expected, food writing tuned up my ear and my eye in a way that I think we haven't always, food writing hasn't always gotten the credit for being the really great writing that it so often is.
Yeah.
I mean, good food writing is good writing, right? I think it just happens to be where I started, but it taught me a lot.
Yeah. Well, so, I'm interested. One of the things that I was really struck by reading The Fixed Stars is I've read your previous two memoirs as well. And if folks here haven't read them, well, I'm curious. I mean, I feel like I want to say you should all go read them right now. But at the same time, one of the things that was so striking to me about The Fixed Stars was that it felt very much like a revision of your earlier memoirs. And my sense as a reader was that you, or at least as I was reading it for maybe the first third of the book, I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, she's revising her earlier memoirs. I wonder if she realizes she's doing that, which of course is me being an idiot. And of course you knew what you were doing it, because there's this incredible point in the book where I just sort of put the book down and was like, oh shit, this is incredible. There's a conversation between you and your therapist that happens somewhere in the middle-ish of the book that I thought felt so much like an axis around which the narrative shifted very dramatically. Everything before that conversation was you fighting against the idea that your sense of yourself and your past required revisiting and revision. Mm-hmm. And then after that conversation, the book became about accepting the notion that you are always you, regardless of what happens around you and how you see yourself. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious how you view this third memoir, which revises so much of the earlier two in the context of a body of work.
Oh, well, I love this question. When I first knew that I wanted to write this book, I felt, for one thing, really embarrassed that I was writing a third memoir. I mean, for God's sakes, that's a lot of writing about oneself. And another thing that tripped me up, and this tripped me up from day one of this story, both, the lived experience, the jury duty experience that the book starts with, and the writing process. I was so tripped up by the thought that that I had somehow been a fraud without knowing it, that I had been a fraud even to myself. That somehow, that I had told these stories very publicly of my life, but then this shift came along, and in many ways it sort of did undo all the stories that came before it. And this shift, because it was about my sexual orientation, which was something that I think until very, very recently, I think that teenagers these days are way ahead of us in thinking about the fluidity of sexual orientation. But I mean, certainly, for me as a kid growing up during the AIDS epidemic and living in a very conservative place and trying to explain to peers who were saying derogatory things about gay people or about HIV or AIDS, I would always say, well, they're born that way. They can't help it. They're born that way. And so then to find in myself that all of a sudden there was this queerness inside me, I felt like I had been a fraud to everyone, including myself, that if we're born this way, it must have been in me all along, and I must have conveniently hidden it even from myself. And that question and that shame and that confusion really propelled me, I think, to start writing the book in the first place. Like a desire to sort of do an archaeology of my own story and figure out like where I missed the signs.
Do you feel like your earlier two memoirs still stand?
Yeah, I do actually. Now that I came out on the other side of writing this book, I do. I think that they are reflective of who I was at the time that I wrote them, which sounds so obvious, but one of the things that I wrote about in this book is the idea that we can only know of ourselves what we know at any given time, which again seems so obvious. However, I think a lot of us, myself included, spend a lot of our time feeling like there are things that we should know or understand that we don't know and understand yet, and racing to catch up, feeling that other people get it before we do. I have found it really, this sounds so cheesy, but I found it very healing to be able to just say, like, I knew what I knew when I wrote those.
I mean, I don't think that's cheesy at all. I think that if you don't allow yourself to trust who you are at the moment of writing, you never write anything. Mm-hmm. You know, that's so much of what I think can stop people from feeling comfortable telling their stories in whatever medium it might be, is that sense of doubt about who you are at the moment that you're doing the telling. And you can wait forever to feel like you are complete and it's time to tell the story, and it's never going to come.
Well, and to me, like from the perspective of writing, it reminds me, you know, that Ira Glass quote that went around a bunch about being a beginner, right? Like that sort of helps explain, for anybody who hasn't heard this quote, Ira Glass basically said this thing about how like nobody ever tells this to beginners, but like the reason that, oh, now my dog is barking. This is so convenient.
Mine at the
Alice,
same moment.
Alice, no. So, you know the feeling that I think everyone who is engaged in a creative endeavor feels, this feeling of looking at something that you did in the past, maybe even last week, and just finding it like repellent. Like you can see everything that's wrong with it. It looks terrible to you. There's so much you would change. Ira Glass talks about how, like, what gets us into creative work in general is this idea that, or is that we have taste, that we care about this thing that we're doing, whether it's writing or ceramics or whatever. But the fact that we have taste trips us up for a very long time, because the very fact of our having taste means that we can see that we're not very good at it for a very long time. Like, so this idea that we're always writing or we're always doing whatever we're doing from where we are in that moment. And it can be very painful to look at what we've done when it's done, because each time we do this creative thing, we're getting better at it. And that's why it hurts so much to look at the old stuff. And I think about that when I think about my first two books, and how all the things I wish I could change, not only, you know, in terms of the way that I wrote them or the story inside them, but I did the best I could with what I had and what I knew.
Yeah, that's a beautiful and inspiring way of talking about it. I like that a lot. It makes me feel like I'm ready to like go write this story that I've been very stuck on for a number of weeks. So thank you for the personal advice that I deeply needed.
My pleasure. I will come back to you and ask you to give it back to me when I'm stuck, like 2 days from now. So.
Anytime.
Mm-hmm.
I think now actually might be a really good moment. You had mentioned that there was a passage from the book that you would like to read for us.
Sure.
I think now is the time, because I have a feeling it's going to set up some of my next questions.
Speaking of being a beginner, this is a section I haven't read aloud yet. So, so anyway, let's see how it goes. Okay, so this is from the opening chapter of the book, very early in the story. I I catch an early bus and find I have a half hour to spare. I've worn a linen dress that I bought a couple of years before June was born. Usually I only ever wear jeans, but now that I'm on a jury, I decide to look like someone who takes this seriously. I sit down in a stripe of weak sunlight on a bench outside the courthouse and pull out a thermos of coffee and my magazine from yesterday. The defendant is arriving, and he sits with his attorneys on a low wall outside the front door. I watch them over my magazine. They huddle like football players, eyes closed. It looks like they're praying. The testimony takes 4 days. It's a civil disobedience case, and the judge has told us not to talk about it with anyone outside the courtroom, not even our families. We're not supposed to look up news stories about it or Google anyone involved. Each morning we wait in the assembly room, and the bailiff takes us to a restricted access elevator at the back of the building, careful not to cross anyone else bound for the courtroom. I don't want to be here, but since I am, I will do this right. I tune my body like an antenna, listen and take notes. The woman in the men's suit has an accent, something approximately Southern. I can't put my finger on it. I wonder how she wound up in Seattle. I wonder where in the city she lives. She's got a trustworthy haircut, what an insurance salesman might get in a Midwestern barbershop. It's a lesbian haircut, I think. Her suit is the gray of spent charcoal, and the fabric swings loose around her legs when she walks. From my seat, I can see her profile, the nose a little too large for its face, a pair of broken-in black cowboy boots under the table. I watch her wrists. They're slim, elegant, the bones delicate as songbirds. I could loop my fingers around her wrist and make the tips touch. On the day that her client gives testimony, she stands up to question him and walks toward the jury box, stops a few feet from me. She rests her yellow-lined pad on the half wall that separates the jury from the courtroom, folds her hands and rests them on top. Her wrists. I watch how the tendons move, taut as a cable-stayed bridge. Sweat prickles my palms. I'm relieved when she sits back down. What is this? Am I attracted to her? I've never been with a woman, had only considered it once, and then only briefly. Why am I looking at her? The next day, she's not doing anything special, just sitting beside her client at the table, and I notice that I'm watching her again. This time, she turns in her seat and looks at me. It's just for a second, and then we both look away, but not before something cold crackles up the back of my neck. I can hear my pulse in my ear. She's caught me. She knows I was watching her. Everyone must know it. A second later, of course not. Don't be crazy. It would be stupid to think she's noticed me at all. This is her job. To her, I'm a juror. Of course I would look at her. But she's got to have noticed. I'm not looking, I'm watching. She's got to have noticed. I know myself to be dense about certain things, moments and actions that other people tell me are obvious. I stare at people, forgetting that they might see me staring and think it's rude. It's not that I think they can't see me, it's that I do not think at all. I can never tell when a person is flirting with me or when I'm flirting. Here's a liability for the owner of a restaurant. I cannot tell when someone is drunk. Unless it's formally declared or ratified by others present, like a UN resolution, I assume a person is just annoying or unusually friendly. But if I've noticed me watching, why wouldn't she? What the fuck am I doing? She's probably seen my wedding ring. If she has, she's read me. I see it now, a satin sash across my chest with the whole story embroidered on it. I'm straight, married for nearly a decade, with a house in the suburbs, a not quite 3-year-old, a family dog, and 2 restaurants that I own with my husband. Shame creeps along my cheek like a spider. When I cannot watch her, I think about watching her. I think all the time about it. I leave the house each morning with my thermos of coffee, thinking. I walk down our street, turn the corner, walk a few more blocks, and board the bus, thinking. One morning mid-trial, I catch the headline of a fellow bus rider's newspaper. The Supreme Court had ruled on Obergefell versus Hodges, making the same-sex marriage legal across the United States. I choke back a sob, elated and disbelieving. And then I want to cry for a different reason, and I cannot tell anyone why. I think about her wrists and her white teeth. I wonder what she thinks about me. Then I remember not to think about that, because she probably doesn't think about me. And if she does, it cannot be good. I am a person wearing a wedding ring while staring at a person who is not her spouse. The judge is speaking again, and I'm not listening. I'm watching the woman in the suit. Under the crisp lapels of her jacket, there's a swelling across her chest, a softness that says female. I wonder what it would feel like to put my arm around her, how her shoulders would be solid, more substantial than my own. If I think on it, I can feel them under my triceps, sound as a fence. I wonder what she wears when she's not wearing this suit, on the weekends or after work. I wonder what her friends call her. I wonder what she would look like next to me in a photo. I've had crushes since being with Brandon. A few, mostly little things, banal. We'd joke about them. For years, he nursed a crush on the actress Natalie Portman. It was like that. It was safe. But I'd had another type of crush too. Other men I'd wanted without saying a word. There were only one or two of them, but these men loomed over us. I never called his attention to their elephantine, it's hard to say that loud, elephantine shadows. Telling him would have made them more real, made actual people out of these dark shapes, made distractions into danger. It would have frightened us both. Instead, I chipped away at the shadows privately, interrogated them into submission. Do I want to be someone who cheats? No, I don't want to be someone who would do that. Am I willing to do that to Brandon? He doesn't deserve that. Can I get what I want by cheating without also getting what I don't want? No, 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 always no. Even if the conclusion had been a brief yes, which it never had, this fact would stop me. The lust would wear off. The sheen would dull. I knew it would. I'd still be me, just with a different set of problems.
That's such an incredible section. I love that you chose that to read. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about why that's a section you've felt drawn to reading today?
The opening of the book is actually the first part of it that I wrote, which certainly isn't often the case, I think, at least not in my own work. But I felt so, when I first started to write the early chapters of this book about 3 years ago, I felt so much adrenaline when I thought about writing what was happening inside me. All of these very kind of murky feelings. I mean, it was really like nothing but a jumble of feelings. But I felt so excited by the prospect of giving myself permission to rebuild those scenes in words and go back inside them and try to see what I was seeing and why it devastated me the way it did. And so I find it so interesting now to go back to those passages, knowing that they were some of the first ones I wrote, because I remember the energy of writing those and how good it felt to, like, do you ever have like places you went in your childhood that you find yourself like thinking about, or like the bathroom in a friend's house and you can remember what the carpet was like, and it feels very satisfying to go back inside and look around. And that's how I felt about giving myself permission to do that, to go back into that courtroom in my head.
Yeah. No, so in this particular passage, and also really throughout the book, the way that you write is so attuned to physicality, both your body as its own character almost in the memoir, and then also describing things in very intensely sensory ways. And something that I would really love to talk about is the book is really sexy. There's a lot that's heartbreaking, and there's a lot that's deeply inspiring and insightful and brilliant and beautiful, but there are some moments that are like really hot. And I think that there's a real art to being able to write about lust and sex, whether the thought or the practice, without it being just truly horrifying. I mean, I don't know if you read the Bad Sex in Fiction Awards every year, but it's like,
I don't know.
The Literary Review, which is this British publication, does the annual Bad Sex in Fiction Awards, and it's the best rabbit hole to lose yourself down.
I'm writing this down.
They're truly atrocious. But one of the things that I mean, and I read them every year, and they're hysterical and awkward and just like brilliantly cringeworthy. But one of the things that's amazing is how much some of them are truly awful, right? Like it'll like describe people's body parts in ways that just should never be done. But the line between really bad sex writing and really good sex writing is often not just vanishingly narrow, it's often like not a straight line, right? Like sometimes there are things that in one context are just the hottest thing in the world, and in other contexts would be just like genital napalm, right? So I'm sorry that I said that phrase. What a nightmare. I'm glad this is being recorded and it's been preserved forever.
Genital napalm.
Yeah, this is a nightmare. But sex is also like, sex and physicality are essential to the sort of story that you're telling, because it's a story about revising your sense of sex, and your sense of what sex is and how to have sex and what constitutes sex. And I think that there have been a lot of lines drawn in the history of all sorts of writing between food writing and sex writing, this sort of idea of like writing about sensation, about physical experiences, trying to put the subjective into something that is plausibly objective in order to transmit it to someone else. But I don't know, how did you learn how to write about sex? How did you figure it out? What was it like to revisit physicality like that in a memoir context?
I felt so excited to get to try it. I think my excitement to get to try it outweighed my fear of doing it wrong, or of actually the other fear that felt more present to me was a fear that this was not, like, that people didn't want to know this about me. And I think that's something that has lingered from, I think that food writing, at least in the part of it that I occupied for a long time, wants us to be very cute and palatable. And I don't feel cute or palatable a lot of the time. And I wanted to write, about what it felt as an adult woman to think about what kind of sex I wanted to have, and to try to capture that in language, because I think that that in heteronormative relationships, even ones that are really sex positive, I mean, at least in my own, I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about what is sex going to mean to me, and what does it mean if the person has the same body parts that I do. And that I found just incredibly exciting to explore. There are children playing outside. It's such a perfect time for me to talk about this, while accompanied by the sounds of children playing.
I mean, some kinds of sex makes children.
That's true. It's true.
All
That's
connected.
where babies come from. I hope that we didn't have any listeners who didn't know.
Spoiler alert.
No, but what I was going to say is that for one thing, I think queer sex is super hot. And I think it's super hot for a lot of us, whether you're queer or not. I think that the idea of sex that interrogates what is pleasure, what is allowed, that interrogates roles and boundaries is really interesting. And it doesn't have to be kinky or extreme in order to fulfill these criteria of being this really interesting exploration and negotiation of me and you. And so I wanted to try to capture, through the specificity of my experience, having sexual encounters for the first time with someone with the same body parts that I have. I wanted to try to capture some of that, and I didn't know how to do it other than to try to stay attuned both to our physical bodies and also, so Garth Greenwell has spoken a lot about like what sex can do in writing, and for him in fiction in particular. But he talks about, I'm going to butcher what he says, but he talks about sex as a way of putting interiority on the page, that like sex is a deeply interior experience, and that it can achieve a lot in storytelling on the page because it is so deeply personal and so interior. And so I hope that what I did was manage to try to tune into my interior experience and the physicality of it in equal parts. But I didn't know what I was doing. I was just trying to do what felt hot to me and also accurate.
Just like sex itself.
Yes.
The metaphor is perfect.
Accurate.
What feels good to you
Is what I'm always going for, accuracy.
Well, yeah, I think it's an important sexual characteristic. You know,
mm-hmm.
There's something to be said for setting out a goal and accomplishing it, whatever the goal may be.
Yes.
Yeah, no, for sure. So we have just a couple of more minutes before I think we're going to open up to questions. But the last thing that I want to talk about is unlike many of the many memoirs that I have read, in the Fixed Stars, you have this recurring motif of referencing other writers and other people and scientific studies and magazine articles and poetry. And there's at the end of the book, there's an extensive bibliography and there's a citation list. And you do have also, as a recurring motif through the story, this conversation about stars and their fixedness, which I guess gives the book its title. And it seems to me like those citations, the references throughout the book, sort of become points that you orient yourself around, much like the stars orient themselves to one another.
Oh, I love the way you put that.
Thank you. And I wonder how you collected these over did they come before the writing? Did they come during the writing? Did you uncover progressions within the memoir once you found quotes or stories or studies that helped send you in certain directions?
It was all of the above. Some of it came before. In fact, when I first started like sort of taking notes about what was happening in my life or what I was thinking as relates to this story, it was not just because of what was happening in my life, but also because of what I was reading to try to make sense of what was happening to me. So I think the development of the idea, because I entered into writing this book with these questions, right? The writing process naturally went hand in hand with a lot of reading. In fact, I miss that period of time so much, like feeling this imperative to read and immerse myself like almost like to charge up my batteries to keep doing my work. And so part of it was that I was doing a lot of reading to try to grapple with some of the thematic questions in the book. But some of it too was that, you know, I feel immensely grateful to have gotten to write this particular story and to have gotten to have it published, because I am a white, straight, presenting woman of great privilege. And the fact that I get to write this book and have my voice heard when a lot of other queer people don't, I feel hugely indebted to the queer writers who have come before me, and to people writing about queerness in general, who made this a topic that people can write about. And so I felt a duty to immerse myself in sort of what came before me, at least to a certain degree. I mean, I could spend a lifetime doing that. But to really read things that that I felt I owed a tremendous debt to, whether it was, for instance, Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg, or She, He, it's S/He by Minnie Bruce Pratt, who was Leslie Feinberg's partner. Or the work of Joan Nestle, who's edited a number of collections about desire between butches and femmes, trying to really steep myself in sort of what came before me as both a way of educating myself and of sort of paying homage, because I certainly am not the first person to have this experience, nor am I the first person to write about it. So I wanted to kind of be in conversation with those voices, both as I wrote the book and in the actual text. They helped me hugely.
It gives such an, as a reader, it gives such an extraordinary sense of, like, you know, it's your memoir and you tell it so intimately, but by locating it within all of these contexts, you create so many windows of universality, and it's a really powerful reading experience.
Oh, thank you. That means so much to me.
Oh, good. Well, I feel like it's a freaking terrific book, and you know, it was, I don't know. I made my husband read it, and he was like, "Are you trying to tell me something?" And I was like, "No. I just need you to read this." You quoted at one point, I think it was Mary Oliver or her partner, saying that their marriage had been a 40-year conversation.
Yes.
Which I loved, and it reminded me of my marriage. I was like, that's why I want you to read it, because we're that relationship. But
I love that.
It's a marvelous book. It's so
Thank you.
Well, on the heels of lots of complimenting, and you should all be buying the book, and you should be buying it from Greenlight. I think it's time for us to go over to some questions. So I see we have a number of them piling up here in the Q&A window, but for any of you who have questions that you've been holding in your hearts for the last 45 minutes, type them in there, and I will sort of randomly pick some and read them out loud, and Molly can answer them.
Excellent.
So let's jump in. Oh, I love this. Did you have a specific intention when writing the story, and then were you surprised by the other paths that emerged?
I think my specific intention, I think it was very specific. I think that I wanted to answer this question of, was I this way all along? Was I closeted even to myself? And it shifted hugely for me as I wrote the book, not only because I found texts, Lisa Diamond's study of sexual fluidity just being one of them, but I found texts that sort of reassured me that that it is possible for people to change dramatically in a lifetime, and that many of us experience our sexuality to be a changeable thing. But what surprised me is that by the end, I came to care less about the actual answer to that question, And I don't think it's just because I sort of came to a conclusion that was satisfying to me. I think it's because in the process of writing the story, I began to believe myself more. I think I went into the story not really believing not believing my interpretation of what happened to me. And the effort of writing it and of surrounding myself with other writers who were grappling with some of the same questions freed me up to not need the answer so much, and instead to get kind of curious about bigger questions like what is selfhood anyway, and how have like philosophers thought about what makes us ourselves if we can acknowledge that huge parts of us change. So yeah, I feel like this book more than my first two, and I think it shows in every way. I wrote this book because I needed something, and the actual writing of it gave that to me.
Great. Oh, the one I was going to ask just scrolled off my screen. Here we go. You wrote really movingly about your dad in your first book. And when you spoke this evening about feeling fraudulent, I wondered whether you worried that he had known a version of you or hadn't known a version of you that he really needed to know in order to love you.
You know, I didn't really think about, I do remember feeling great gratitude, especially as I was living the parts of the book that happen in like 2016, mid 2016, some of the more like intense sort of anxiety parts of the book. I remember feeling really grateful that he was not here to see it. Not because I doubted his ability to love me for who I am, but because in many ways I think losing him or not having him around made me a bit stronger in terms of getting through it. I think that for all the times that I've missed him, and for like, you know, every big event in my life, I feel this whole new wave of grief for his loss. I think last week for me, when the book came out, was sort of equal parts grief about him and about like all kinds of things, as it was excitement that the book was finally in the world. But I feel really lucky that I don't doubt that he would have loved me for whoever I was. But in many ways, I'm glad that I've gotten to enter into adulthood with an awareness of what it is to lose someone, and with, I think, the knowledge that there was one less person I had to fall back on, and the way that I think has made me able to rise to the occasion in places where I might not if he were still alive. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah.
Yeah. I think we probably have time for one more. So I'm going to ask you one that maybe has a big answer, but maybe, I don't know, maybe it also has a very quick one. It depends. That's why it's a good question. You've mentioned since your coming out post on Orangette that you sometimes don't think you are quote unquote queer enough, or that other people don't think that you're queer enough. But I think that you write about queerness in such an honest and eloquent way, says the question asker. I haven't finished the book, working on it, so maybe you address this, but where are you right now with the idea of queerness and how others define it?
Oh, I'm really glad you asked, whoever you are.
Great job, Rachel.
It's something that I feel like is evolving for me. I think that the relationship with Nora, the Nora character, was a really challenging one for me to enter into as a first queer relationship, because I think that her particular community, her particular version of queer community was very self-policing, which I think is often the case in a lot of communities where there is a history of trauma or marginalization or oppression. And so I entered into queerness right away feeling that I was, that my being a mom meant that I was doing it wrong, that I was, that I looked too straight, that I didn't know the rules. And I remember thinking when I ended that relationship, like, oh my God, I felt like I felt angry at myself that I had let myself believe those things. And now actually, I'm not grateful for that. I don't think I needed to learn what I learned in that relationship in order to get through life. But I can now see so much more clearly in my current relationship the degree to which I think queerness for me is and maybe will always be as personal as my experience of straightness. I never felt like a part of any community because of any particular identity I've had. And I think that sort of a gift of my current relationship with Ash is that that we are learning together and showing each other through an everyday life that is very queer by all definitions, but from the inside kind of feels just like any other love experience. I think that I'm learning that that for me, queer community is like any other kind of chosen family, and I may have it and I may not, but I don't. I've stopped expecting it to be something that I would automatically feel a part of. Because I think it's as individual as we are. Yeah, I feel really grateful to not, and this is certainly a comfort of being in a committed relationship, is I feel really grateful to not be grappling so much with whether or not I fit or whether or not I am queer enough. I'm queer enough for the two of us, and that's pretty great.
When my husband and I first got engaged, we are different religions. I'm Jewish and he's Coptic Christian. And because I'm like, I think maybe a little bit like you, I'm sort of an avid self-help book buyer, and then I like read half of them and think they're garbage and don't continue reading them. I bought like 1 million books about interracial relationship, or not interracial, interreligious, multi-faith, interfaith relationships. And we're also in an interracial relationship, but that's unrelated. And almost all of the books about interfaith relationships were useless, except for the first sentence of one of them, which I think about almost every single day of my life, and it applies to so many things. The first sentence of this book was, every relationship is an interfaith relationship.
Because, that's amazing.
Right, because who you are and how you connect to your sense of whether it's faith or identity or your sexuality or your community or your race or your position in, you know, privilege or your position in marginalization, every single person relates to everything differently. And this book then went on to not give terribly terrific advice, but for that one sentence, every relationship is an interfaith relationship, it just exploded this whole idea for me of, you know, you don't have to have broad categories that you conform to, and you don't have to find ways that your broad category connects to their broad category. You just have to find the ways that the two of you are the same and different and can mesh within that.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I'm so glad that I love that. I'm gonna remember that now too.
I'm gonna hope that the folks from Greenlight cut in when we're close to running out of time, but I'm just going to keep running through these questions because they're great. And also, I love this next one, and it was something that I meant to ask you when I was asking you about writing about sex, but this is such a perfect and pointed thing. The question is, I love your use of the word fuck, often intentionally and powerfully in the book. Can you talk to us about your use of the word fuck?
Yeah, I think this is a tricky thing, right? Because it can be used badly, or it can be used in places where it's not effective. And I think that I felt drawn to letting myself use it here where it accurately conveyed an emotion or like a feeling about sex. Like there's a part later in the book where I say I wanted to be fucking someone. I think there's a big difference between saying I wanted to be fucking someone and like I wanted to be fooling around. Like there is like a difference in weight and tone. And so I think that for me, using these words that are tricky to use because of their weight in a lot of respects, I think that I tried to use them in places where there was no other word that would do, or where I could not be accurate to the gravity of thought or judgment that I was having on myself, for instance, without actually representing on the page the way I was talking to myself in my head.
Amazing. Well, on that note, I think that the lovely folks at Greenlight are telling us to wrap up. And a reminder to everybody that you can and should buy this and Molly's other books and read them all, but this one especially. It's such an incredible piece of literature, and it's so generous and it's so beautiful, and I feel like I should have come up with a list of adjectives before we hopped on, because I can never remember the right words when I'm trying to remember them. But God, it's such a great fucking book, Molly.
That means so much to me. I have loved your work for so long, and I felt very nervous sending this book to you. Anyway, so that means a huge amount to me. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for writing it. It was exactly what I needed to read, and I think it's exactly what a lot of people who have already read it and who are going to read it are gonna find. That I lost that sentence. It's so good. Go buy the book. It's amazing. Just read the book and thank Molly for it later. I guess that's it. I don't know. Do we wrap up? Do people hop back on? Do they tell us where to go? Hello.
Hi. I do come back on. Thank you both so much for that wonderful discussion. And thanks to everybody for joining us. If you missed any of tonight's event, or if you just want to watch it again, the recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, so please look out for it there. Make sure to get your copy of The 6 Stars in our store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody, and thanks to you both. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.